Thank you, Mindy. Okay, so we're almost at lunch, but we have one panel left to go. So, hi, my name is Kiyana Asemanfar. I'm here on behalf of California Common Cause. We were one of the supporters of the Voters' Choice Act and also one of the many organizations who supported implementation in Sacramento County and are currently working on implementation here in LA County. We're also a member of the Voters' Choice California Steering Committee, and we just heard Mindy talk a little bit about that, but the VCC project was launched by FOS, the Future of California Elections, and the intention was to provide support to county officials and local organizations and provide them with the tools and support to educate voters about the VCA during this implementation process. So we serve on that committee along with the League of Women Voters, NALEO, Disability Rights California, and both the Sacramento and Orange County Registrar of Voters. So I'd like to introduce our next panel, if we could have our panelists come up. But the focus of this panel will be on Sacramento County, which was the largest county to implement the Voters' Choice Act last year. And joining us on the panel, we'll have Paul Spencer from Disability Rights California, Vang from Hmong Innovating Politics, and Colin with Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, Los Angeles. So a little bit about Sacramento County. Again, it was the largest county to move forward last year in 2018 with the Voters' Choice Act. And they have about 700,000 registered voters, and they established 80 vote centers. So it was large compared to other counties, but obviously not as large as what we're launching here in LA County. But I do think there are some valuable lessons to learn. Also, given the diversity of the county, there are quite a few groups in Sacramento County, language minority groups that had to be involved during this transition process, and that some of our panelists today worked very, very closely with. So I think there are some great lessons there. As far as the local coalition, so Voters' Choice California also helped with the establishment of local hubs in the first 5 counties. In Sacramento, we called it the Sacramento Vote Coalition. And the role of the group was basically to bring together community organizations, local government officials, advocates, and help with the implementation of this new program. And they actually had an interesting model in that they had various subcommittees dedicated to certain tasks. So they established a speakers bureau. They had an intergovernmental committee that worked very closely with the mayor's office there. They had a media committee and a language committee working on translating materials. And they also worked very closely with the LAC and VAC hosted by the county. Without further ado, let's get into the panelists' remarks. So first here we have Paul Spencer from Disability Rights California. Paul is a staff attorney with Disability Rights California's Voting Rights Practice Group. He works on issues across California affecting voters with disabilities and is focused on removing barriers to voter registration, improving in-person accessible voting, and empowering people with disabilities to vote. And he also serves on the VSAP Advisory Committee here in Los Angeles. Vang, to his right, is the Executive Director of Hmong Innovating Politics. She is the co-founder and Executive Director, and the mission of Hmong Innovating Politics is to strengthen the power of disenfranchised communities through innovative civic engagement and strategic grassroots mobilization. Founded in 2012, HIP, which is the acronym, set out to address the lack of representation and voices at the decision-making table. Previously, she worked tirelessly as a community organizer to improve outcomes for children and families in the Sacramento region, and she was also born in the refugee camps of Thailand and raised in South Sacramento. And then to her right, we have Colin, who is the Director of Civic Engagement at Churla and the Program Director with Churla Action Fund. Her work at Churla began as a student volunteer in 2009, and in 2013, she was hired on as a statewide campaign organizer. During the midterm election last year, she ran the Immigrant Political Power Project, which helped contact over 240,000 low-propensity African-American, Latino, and immigrant voters, and she's going to talk a little bit more about GOTV strategies. So our first panelist up is Cha. So, Cha.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. So My name is Vang, and so Executive Director of Hmong Innovating Politics. And as in my intro, we started in 2012. Really, in the frustration of like we having access to power, but not actually having access doesn't always equal power. And how do you build communities to have power to make change, right? As mentioned, our mission is to strengthen the political power of Hmong and disenfranchised communities. And when we say Hmong and disenfranchised, we are a Hmong organization ran by Hmong women. But we also recognize that we don't live in a vacuum, and our communities also live among other communities of color who also have issues that impact them just the way we do, and that we are, as a collective and as an organization, we are centering the most impacted in all our work, and that sometimes doesn't mean it's our Hmong community, but that if we can make change for the most impacted, then our communities benefit. And we have an office in Sacramento and Fresno, so we are also doing some work on VCA implementation in Fresno. Okay, so I want to just really touch base on our coalition building. As mentioned, we actually had a really robust community-based organization coalition, which we call Sacramento Vote. I'm gonna just pull up the website that we, as a collaborative, established. So. Yeah, so we bought the site and the link so that we can, we didn't even know that you can have a .vote. And so that was something that we loved. And through the support of the California Endowment, paid for some of the graphic, but and as you can see, there's a theme in color. In our very first meeting with our register, we asked if the change in the color of our envelopes were going to be different. And so they stayed with, it's pink in Sacramento. So we decided as a coalition to continue to have that pink theme throughout our county. So that was our website. If you go all the way down, there is all the organizations that were a part of our coalition. And it was really, and each of the organizations brought in different things. And so we wanted to make sure that we were utilizing their expertise. And as mentioned, you can actually get out of the website. And I also wanted to talk about the coalition work in terms of, we had a collective for our EAP. We wanted to make sure that as a collective, we were making a comment on the EAPs, just not as individual organizations. And so we drafted a letter with the support of Common Cause and ACLU. The organizations went through the EAP, gave the comments, and ACLU and Common Cause wrote the letters so that it also was the language was appropriate. And as a coalition, we all signed on it and submitted it to our county register. So this is actually one of the coalitions. So we had these pink, paid for the California Endowment. They didn't actually give funds to organizations to do the VCA work, but what they committed to was that if we can establish plans of how to like educate, and then they'll do the outreach or the big billboards and stuff. And as a coalition, they actually, the California Endowment put some money into our RT transportation, but our transportation or RT agency declined the funds to allow the signage on the buses because they thought it was too political. And so when we found out, the coalition found out, what we did was, because we had the mayor's staff on our coalition with, in addition to other government entities, they actually stepped in and had a conversation with RT, and ultimately we were able to put on every single bus. And so this is a picture of one of the signs, and then every single, like at every single corner, you had these billboards. And on the bottom, it had the coalition members a part of it. And as you can see, it all says Sacramento.vote, so it linked back to our community organizations. one of the good things about Coalition is that because we also know that those little postcards that the county sent out could go in the trash. As a coalition, we asked our mayor to put in money to buy rack cards for every year. So they purchased 50,000, both in the primary and the general election, to have these rack cards that organizations across Sacramento County can come and pick up boxes and distribute to other organizations, to community members. School districts came and got boxes, and it was in one. It's always in one location, and that they can pick it up. So it was back to it's two-sided English and Spanish, and then we had these flags, pink flags, and then coalition members went across Sacramento County posting pink flags and every single vote center. And so that was only possible with the coalition coordinating time and effort to go out and get those flags out. So we also have, as a coalition, we planned out press conference for 11-day vote center launches and 4-day vote center launches. And we had it across the county. So not just in Sacramento, the city of Sacramento, but across the county. Our running joke is that Mayor of City of Sacramento, Mayor Steinberg, was the mayor of every single city because he was at every single launch, even if it wasn't in the city. And so, but we love the presence of like just a collective voice in terms of our electeds too. And as a coalition, we did adopt vote centers. One of the things was that if an organization took on a vote center and celebrated with voters, that they would turn out a little more. And so this is one of the pictures of one of our vote centers. And the community members brought tons of food and they celebrated with everybody. But they didn't actually, like everybody who walked in got food, and everybody who walked in got an opportunity to like learn about voting, even if they're not a registered voter. I'm like rushing. Okay. We also, I want to talk a little about HIP's work, right? Because we are a Hmong organization, we wanted to make sure that we are also catering to our own communities. And so we did, this is our outreach piece, which my face is on there, but we, and our translation piece, our community is predominantly vote by mail, and we didn't actually want to confuse them any more than if they're talking about the whole VCA changes. So that's something that we did. I also we're a field campaign organization, so we also did walk pieces. And we, as a way for us to cater to the community, we wanted to leave behind pieces that actually only get them the information that they need so that they're not confused. And so that's one of the tactics that we really went with. And I just want to show some of the pictures of our group. And then one of this picture is, if you can see, there's a little sticker on it. GTV weekend, we posted up the closest vote center for them onto our walk pieces to make sure that they are informed about the closest one to them. I quickly, before I move on, for the coalition piece, coalition building, it's actually very important that we address that we should, as a community advocacy group, that we establish a community advocacy group outside of the controlled county and a registered, city register, just because this is actually a place for community organizations to vent. And then by the time it gets to the register, we have our stuff sorted out, right? And it opens it up so that allows everybody, the organizations to feel free to say what they need to say about the process, and so that we can figure out solutions rather than just throwing out all these issues to our registers, and that's more effective. One more point. We actually, Sacramento County operated without a register for most of our general and our primary and general election. That allowed us to also be as, we call it, we went rogue, but that allowed us to push for, it actually benefits just because we got the opportunity to have conversations with our board of supervisors to push for more funding and stuff, just because we knew that there's no register, and we can continue. But so go Rogue. But I really appreciate it. I was just telling James that I loved your presentation, because as I'm thinking, I was like, okay, I really appreciate some of the thoughtfulness of around LA County and what you all are planning to do. Because we talk about language access and language justice in our work, and I appreciate the thought for language justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Cha. So to that point, actually you brought up an interesting piece about Adopt a Vote Center in Sacramento County. I actually wanted to just bring up the fact that we're doing the same thing here in LA County. So one of the biggest challenges in transitioning to the vote center model is finding facilities that are available with all the requirements for that 4 or 11-day period. So if you have an office or a facility that you know of that might be a suitable location to serve as a vote center, we really, really want to hear from you. I think also another way you can adopt a vote center is not just by providing or suggesting a facility, but you can your organization or group of volunteers can also adopt a vote center and staff that vote center for that 4-day or 11-day period. Another thing that they did in Sacramento was promote a specific vote center and have events at that vote center to really bring the community out. And we've seen actually some research about parties at the polls really being successful in increasing turnout and also bringing that community feel that a lot of people value about polling places to vote centers as well. So really encourage you all here, if you have a facility available or want to get a group together to adopt a vote center, please do so and also spread the word about that. I forgot to mention too at the beginning, we are going to have a Q&A session. So if you could write your question on the white note card on your table and just raise that up, and we'll be collecting questions throughout the session and we'll go through them after the presentations. So now we're going to have Deanna's presentation.
Hi, hello? Hello? Can you hear? Yes? Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Deanna Colin, and I'm the Director of Civic Engagement with the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, CHIRLA, and we're a statewide organization. Anyway, when it comes to getting out the vote, we focus on the immigrant, the Latino, the Spanish-speaking community. We also have a very specific targeted universe of talking to voters, which are considered infrequent voters. So these are voters that don't usually go out to vote, right? So let's just keep that in mind as I talk about what we discovered in activating voters and getting them out to vote and giving them this information in Sacramento County. So initially the plan was to talk to the most people as possible, right? And I mean, like, let's look for these big events where we can do massive outreach, tabling, presentations. And so it was about 2 weeks into it when we felt like that was not the best way for us to go about it. And so it was a quick pivot, right? One, the lessons learned was that we felt like at these events, there was many other organizations giving out the same information. It wasn't, the long, lengthy conversations. It was just like, here's the flyer. Like she mentioned earlier, the county actually only printed out 50,000 cards. So going to these massive events and running out of these cards very quickly. And so it was a limited amount of cards the county provided for the whole county. And it just didn't feel as effective, right? We're like, okay, so let's go back to the drawing board. And what we realized is like, let's just do what we're really good at doing, like individual one-to-one conversations in person and over the phone. We know that works. We use it for every other GOTV program. And so again, going back to these low propensity and now using the voter data that we had through PDI and like filtering them out, who do we really want to talk to? What we actually learned is when you mentioned VCA, they were even more confused, right? Again, these are voters who don't really go out to vote, who go out to vote once every 3 or 4 elections. And so when you talk to them about new ways to vote, they actually come to you like, well, what were the old ways to vote, right? And so we found that instead of just talking about VCA and using that language, we talked about, hey, these are the ways you can vote, and this is the extra time you have to vote. And it just clicked, right? They're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Didn't even go into like, this is the new way of voting. a few things we learned with that too. It's like, okay, the resources to do this work were very, very limited. And so how do we get creative? And I don't know if there's many community organizations in the room today, but what we did, and we encourage all of you to do, is talk to our funders, right? A lot of times the money that comes with the funders is like, well, it's ID on these 2 or 3 questions, and then we know anything after 3 questions, the script becomes way too long. So meeting them halfway, like, well, actually, can we only ID in 1 question? And then have them commit to vote in person or to vote early, right? Something that would mark off the VCA education part of it. And people were actually open and willing to do this, both C3 and C4 funders. So really prioritizing within our script about these new ways of voting. And again, going back to the good old ways, talking to people in their language, talking to people multiple times. Again, when negotiating with funders, like, okay, we know we're going to talk to voters 3 times before Election Day. Can you actually fund us a little bit more to go back and talk to them a 4th time only about the new ways they can vote, right? And then talking to people in their neighborhoods. So we actually did some work in Sacramento, but also some work in Madera County. And we had canvassers from their neighborhoods. We had phone bankers from the neighborhoods making these calls and telling them, you know, actually the church that we go to 2 blocks away is now a voting location. And you can go Saturday or Sunday after your mass or whatever it was, the information. And so making it just, I guess the biggest thing is like sticking to what we know and really making sure that it's qualitative conversations that we're having with these individuals instead of doing the massive outreach, which I think it's important too. In our case, it wasn't our best strategy at Churla and for our community organization. So that's a little bit of what we did. And again, all of June last year, or no, it was last year. Jesus, all of June last year. We prioritized VCA, and then in November we were able to incorporate it to the different campaigns that we had going on because of the lessons learned in June.
Thank you, Deanna. Again, if you all have questions for the panelists, please be sure to write it down on a note card and we'll be collecting it. Our next speaker is Paul Spencer.
Hi, I'm Paul. Yeah, I'm going to borrow that one for you. So for the last 10, 15 minutes, I've been looking for the on switch on my microphone, and I just hoped it was on. I'm with Disability Rights California. We are the protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities in the state of California. We're probably the largest legal services provider in the state. And we have a voting rights practice group that's full-time, does voting work. We have some funding from the Help America Vote Act. There's a cool backstory behind it, but the nice thing is that we have dedicated attorneys that are just working on making sure that voting is accessible. The one issue though is we're statewide, and this is an enormous state with 58 counties. So when the VCA went into effect in 2018, we were pretty nervous about the impact on voters with disabilities in these 5 counties. So, we were really actively involved. We tried to be in the planning, helping build community engagement, working with election officials, and then actually observing the elections to see how they went. Sacramento is the closest of the 5 counties to Los Angeles County, but honestly, the comparison's difficult. I mean, LA is 5 times the size of Sacramento. It's densely urban. It's a lot different, but some of the things that are the same are, there's a lot of nonprofits based in Sacramento. There's a lot of advocates that are interested in elections and election reforms, and it's a similar thing in Los Angeles County. And also, as Cha touched on, in Sacramento County for a time, believe it or not, in the lead up to this biggest change in elections ever, they didn't have a registrar of voters for a good chunk of time. It made things kind of stressful and a little contentious. But on the other hand, Sacramento, like LA County, has had a long-running, accessibility committees for voters with disabilities and language committees as well. And they've been pretty good about getting feedback from people with disabilities. So there was that capacity was already there, similar to kind of what you have here right now. But I really want to talk about forming committees, building local connections. And one way I wanted to talk about that is sort of talk about the videos that DRC produced. So these are YouTube videos we made. In one picture on the left-hand side is a picture of a gentleman in a power wheelchair coming up to a vote center with a sign advertising it. And then the photo on the right is a a gentleman that's using a remote accessible vote by mail system. You know, the reason I want to talk about these videos is, especially the one on the left-hand side, you know, we filmed at a Sacramento Vote Center, and it was a good collaborative between voting rights advocates at independent living centers. So, you know, the Sacramento Registrar of Voters was really gracious. They let us use a room to film in. They brought voting equipment, and they had their staff volunteer. We actually set up a mock vote center to film a video explaining that a vote center is just sort of like a polling location, and it's going to be accessible. You know, one hard thing, and Diana kind of touched on this, is that you know, some people voting in a VCA election, this is their first time voting ever. So you're not really wanting to explain that something is brand new because it's already new to them. So you kind of want to explain that this is how it is. So you kind of need to find that balance when you're trying to make these outreach materials that are easy to understand, but also, you know, capture voters that maybe haven't voted before. And, you know, one challenge for voters with disabilities is, you know, statistically less likely to vote, less likely to be engaged in voting. So, you know, there's some challenges on reaching voters. One thing I'm going to talk about towards the end is, you know, some ways you as an advocate can look at LA's education and outreach plan and try to give some feedback for ways you think it could be more effective. So, you know, just this next photo, this is actually the photo shoot from the Sacramento Vote Center video. The cool thing about this is we have advocates from the Independent Living Center in Sacramento. We also had advocates come from Nevada County, which is nearby, which is another VCA county, much smaller. But, you know, Sacramento, like LA, has a really large staff. I mean, they have dedicated communications and outreach professionals. They have people that know graphic design. These are things that don't exist in most counties in California, like election staff wear a lot of hats. In LA County, they are what, jack of all trades as well. But there's more specialization here, like in Sacramento County, which really pays off. Like even the materials you see that LA County has, I'm looking behind me at the banner, at just the outreach materials that LA County has are just far better than a lot of other counties have. Like they're easier to read, they're easier to see. But, you know, also about this collaborative look, I mean, we have people with a variety of disabilities. So we're trying to get different perspectives. And, you know, you can apply that to your own work, is trying to get different perspectives within your communities to really get involved in education and outreach. So a video is one thing that can be done. It's somewhat elaborate. You know, it takes a lot of coordination. Another thing for education and outreach is like maybe just go a little easier, which is to tag along to existing events. So this slide is from tabling that was done at the California Council of the Blind convention. That's an advocacy, like in a membership group for people that are blind and low vision in the state of California. It has a really wide membership. You know, it's a really good thing to tap into, and they have chapters in local communities around the state. But, you know, Sacramento County and Madera County came and brought accessible voting equipment, and they set up a booth to talk to voters, because this is a great place to talk to people that need to use accessible voting equipment in order to vote privately and independently. So it's great for outreach. It's good for feedback for the elections office. It's not something the election office has to do, but I just included it as an example of something that you can do where you add on to an existing event. You don't have to create your own event focused around elections or the Voters' Choice Act. It can be useful to have a table or try to get a brief speaking slot at some other event. I liked this California account. I thought it was a really effective use of time. So just now we're going to get kind of into the less fun part of my presentation. This is a checklist of the requirements in the Voters' Choice Act. It's available on the voterschoice.org website in the page for election administrators. I think as an advocate, it's worth you looking at this because you can see the requirements laid out. The other way to do it is to print out the election code 4005 and 4006 and highlighter it up and carry it around with you like I do. I think it's useful as an advocate because there's some, you know, the LA County is going to meet these requirements, but you also want to be able to explain to your community and people you meet what the requirements are. And some of them are quite nuanced. So, you know, for example, like what's the difference between a workshop and a consultation meeting? The Voters' Choice Act, you know, it's supposed to be, it's written so it applies to all the counties in California. LA has some special rules that Mr. Logan talked about, but for the most part, they still need to meet all the same education and outreach requirements. And part of that is the difference between consultation and workshops, and you need to understand what those are. I think that's really helpful. So for the next slide is, you know, this is a picture of a ballot drop-off box. I mean, pretty boring. You know, LA's gonna have this everywhere, but I just include it for the reason that this county added a flag. It's a small thing, and it's not something that they're required to do, but a flag is really helpful, for example, if you're on a public transportation route, so you can see where this new ballot drop-off box is. It's a little thing, but it's the kind of thing that you can recommend to the county that could make a big difference. To give you an idea of the scale of LA, this is a picture of an event that LA had on the new voting system. And shoot, there's 80 people there. In other counties that did the VCA, there wouldn't be 80 people in 5 events. So the turnout you can get here is much better. And just to show you, for comparison, this is a workshop that was done in Nevada County. You can see the turnout. It's really low. And part of that, it was new. The county really wasn't sure how to advertise. I don't really think LA County has that outreach problem. And then just the last slide is you have a lot more data to work with here in this county. I mean, this is on the voterschoice.org website. This is a breakdown of where people with disabilities live. So again, there's a lot of advantages here, but again, lots of geographic challenges and just the scale and the numbers of voters here. But that was everything. So I think we're ready to turn it over for questions now. We're doing cards. That might have been a breakdown of the system. Oh, you want to call on Terry? Yeah.
I'm just curious.
So, Terry, one interesting thing is in California, not all polling locations are required to be accessible. I mean, the counties are supposed to make reasonable efforts to make, but as a voter with a disability, you can not be totally sure that where you're going to vote is accessible. The one nice thing about the Voters' Choice Act is the vote centers are required to be accessible, so you know that going up. But one thing from feedback to voters is to vote at a vote center, you're going to have to go farther than a polling location. You're likely going to have to travel farther. So that is burdensome, especially if you use public transportation. So it's just one thing you got to work in, and that's been some of the negative feedback. Some really good stuff, and I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, but there's a requirement for remote accessible vote by mail in the Voters' Choice Act, where you can vote at home using some accessible computer technology, which isn't not high numbers of people using it, but it's really helpful.
So they have not done.
Sacramento County bought new voting equipment from another, standard voting equipment manufacturer. It's accessible. It meets the requirements. Just anecdotally, one of my colleagues, I'm actually not on the VSAP planning committee. It's one of my colleagues at DRC, and he's been involved in the process. He really likes the VSAP. It's got really good feedback. And honestly, voting rights advocates are usually pretty skeptical and pessimistic of things that are supposed to be accessible. So I think it says a lot that people with disabilities are given really good feedback on LA's new voting system. Yeah, you want me to read out? You want to read it or me to read it? Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so there's a question about poll workers. With all the investment based on your experience, were there any investments for poll workers to prepare for the full capacity of voters coming to the polls?
That was one of our critiques in our Sacramento County work. After one of the things that we recognized was that we are hiring, the county was hiring staff that spoke the language, but also didn't provide the necessary training for the transition from to VCA. And so we had coalition members who are traditionally absentee ballot voters vote at vote centers, and that was one of the critiques that we brought back to our county after the primaries and then going to the generals. They were able to really also provide additional training to poll workers. I think always the challenge is how do you train bilingual or vote center workers who are not necessarily who don't necessarily do civic engagement and voter work outside of being a vote center, and how do you train them to be effective workers to the folks that need bilingual assistance. And so those are always the challenges that we are continuing to have conversations with our registrar's office.
If I could, one advantage of the Voters' Choice Act is election officials have to hire less election day workers. So they can be more selective about who they hire. And in the 5 counties that did the VCA, they were typically devoting more time to training than they traditionally would if they were just training polling workers for one day, which is great because you could really hammer in on accessibility and language issues. And for example, in Sacramento County, they got feedback from their committee for voters with disabilities on the training materials. And I attended the training and it was really clear. It was a really effective training on working with voters with disabilities. And they had the luxury of time because they had a little more time to dedicate to vote center worker training.
If I could just add to that, in addition to having the chance to be a little more selective with vote center workers, I also think there's a benefit to the early voting period because the vote center workers kind of get a couple days to get accustomed to the processes in the vote center, and by the time volume kind of kicks up closer to that last weekend before the election, they're really professional. From my experience observing in San Mateo County, for example, the vote center workers were incredibly knowledgeable and professional about their role. So that's one benefit. We do have a question here about, do you have any advice on how to build trust between communities and government in terms of voter engagement?
I think what has worked for us is, as a community organization, is partnering up with the registrar, right? We work with Dean and his team all the time, even hold events together to be like, okay, this is a trusted messenger. I think, so when right now when we're talking about people needing translation the day of, for us, our obstacle is people don't even know what Secretary of State position does, and it's on their ballot, right? People don't know what an insurance commissioner position does, and it's on their ballot. And we feel like once they go to the polling location, they don't have the capacity to explain that to them. I think these questions, there'll be more of these questions because I think Secretary Padilla said it earlier, we're expecting higher turnout for next year. And so we encourage you to partner up with community organizations leading up to the 11 days to be like, hey, we can't do it here, but this community organization by where you live or in this city, in this region, they actually have staff that can help you and walk you through, not tell you who to vote for, but just explain these positions to you, right? Or explain the difference between a Democratic candidate, a Republican candidate, or a no party candidate, or why city council candidates don't have a party under their name. All of that work that needs to be done before election day, before these early voting locations open. So I think that's going to be key for city clerks, for county registers to partner with community organizations that have that capacity and those resources to do that.
I would also add that you'd like to get yourself and your organizations ready to comment on the election administration plan that Mr. Logan mentioned, so that the county is required to put it online and then have public hearings to give feedback. So, it can be nice to give people a lot of warning that, in August or September when this goes out, you're going to need to be ready to attend these meetings and write a letter and look at this election plan. So giving your organization and people you meet a heads up that this is coming and that, this is it's new in California that you can give feedback on election planning. So it's something cool and it's something to kind of train people on how to do. And again, there's some really good resources on the voterschoice.org website for some templates and some things to look for in the Voters' Choice Act. And to remind people, you don't need to be an election law expert. You can just focus on the things that are important to you and your community and just write a letter or make a public comment on that.
Quick comment. I don't know if we can truly get all our voters to trust government, but we can, as Hannah said, we can be the trusted messenger. For our coalition members and our elections office, and even our mayor and our governmental entities that worked in our coalition, we were all under the assumption that we're friends now, but we're not afraid to call you out if we need to make sure that our communities are being at the center of what you're trying to do. And so that is something I think for as community organizations to continue to also center. What we also strategize is like, we can't just wait until ballots dropped. So we did campaigns to educate communities about our precincts that we focus in, and we focus also in low propensity voting precincts. And we did pre-education in terms of contacting and hitting the doors around, like, this is the day it's going to drop. These are some of the new things that you should be looking out for. And then right after the ballots are dropped, we're like, okay, vote centers are open, or drop boxes are open. You can drop it off, early voting. These are the days that you can start going to vote centers. And so that's a strategy that I think as community organizations, especially the ones in the field, to also think about how do you do pre-education and then also right after the ballots, so that it's not like you're waiting for ballots to drop.
Do we have any other questions? So we heard a bit from Deanna about kind of integrating VCA messaging into what you already have planned. And Paul also mentioned the model of kind of tagging along pre-established meetings and integrating VCA messaging into that. I just wanted to take a moment to share this card that LA County has developed. So this has all of the outreach materials that you can imagine. We have a PowerPoint presentation, flyers, media kit, and if you want to be a VSAP ambassador and use these tools and kind of integrate it into the programming that you have planned over this next year, they are looking for VSAP ambassadors, and please ask the county staff about that before you leave today.
And available on the 13th.
Oh, yes, and we have all the translated materials as well on the card, so. Great, okay, so I think we're gonna wrap up the panel and head out to lunch.